I've wanted to make this video since I started this channel, and I've been percolating on this topic now for about 5 years, in that I've just become obsessed with this author's writing. But yeah, I'm talking about Michael Moorcock, and I'm specifically talking about his signature character, Elric of Melnibone. Now, if you're clicking on an Elric video, you probably know something about the character and probably in some ways know more than I do, frankly. But I came to this character in 2020 at the height of the pandemic. Everybody during the pandemic had some kind of interest that was sparked off being inside for so long. Some people got into roller skating. Some people got into exercise. Some people got into cooking. I got into Michael Moorcock, and I got into really morally ambiguous sword and sorcery. If you don't know anything about Elric, I'm just going to give you just a quick primer about why you should care before I cover what is really the topic of this video, and that is how to read Elric. The reason being that Elric can be a bit overwhelming for a new reader. Elric can be a little confusing for a new reader in terms of where the best starting point is. There's so many different reading orders that you'll see floating about here and there. So I wanted to provide my, not newbie perspective, but at least like a newer reader perspective and what I thought worked best for me. But first, Elric, let's talk about him. Okay, Elric really at his core is the anti-Conan the Barbarian, right? When it comes to sword and sorcery, you usually get like these big barrel-chested barbarians, guys that are kind of, if not simple-minded, a little bit more like big blocks of brick, you know? These guys that swing first and ask questions later. You know, that's what sword and sorcery really is by comparison to epic fantasy, which is much more higher magic compared to sword and sorcery's lower magic, et cetera, et cetera. But Moorcock in the early 60s, when he was asked to create a Conan-like character at the beginning of his career by an editor, he created this albino sorcerer emperor who's physically weak, philosophically tormented, and utterly dependent on a soul-draining sword. In reality, he is fantasy's first great anti-hero, and everything that follows in its wake, any sort of white-haired, thinner, morally questionable protagonist or antagonist in fantasy owes a great debt to Elric and Michael Moorcock's writing. Really, Elric didn't just influence fantasy, he rewrote its DNA, right? He was published starting in 1961, and one could really say that he is the direct ancestor of this term grimdark, the kind of thing that we associate with like Malazan, Book of the Fallen, or The Black Company, or the writings of Joe Abercrombie, or of course A Song of Ice and Fire. This was grimdark before grimdark existed, right? You can draw straight lines from Elric to Warhammer's chaos worship, D&D's alignment system with the order and chaos aspects that is really like has its origins in Moorcock's writing by way of Poul Anderson as well, with 3 Hearts and 3 Lions. And of course, the intelligent weapons that people use in Dungeons and Dragons. The Witcher, of course, his morally gray protagonist, is another sort of echo of what began in Elric of Melnibone, and pretty much every cursed weapon trope in modern fantasy. And beyond Elric himself, Moorcock wasn't just writing sword and sorcery stories. He was creating this multiversal framework that Elric in of himself is just one incarnation of a champion who appears across multiple dimensions and timelines, and many other characters throughout Moorcock's entire oeuvre are a part of this eternal champion concept. Arguably, everything that Michael Moorcock has written is considered a part or an aspect of the Eternal Champion in some way, right? It's a great marketing tool, really. But also, it's a sort of predecessor for the kinds of things that Stephen King would do with the Dark Tower connected universe, as well as what we would see with the Marvel multiverse, which I know no one wants to talk about multiverses anymore, but it's all there, and it all started with the writing of Moorcock and his Eternal Champion mythos. And what I really dig about Moorcock's writing, even at its most pulpy in the earlier stages of his career, he was always trying to smuggle in other influences beyond just, let's create a fun adventure yarn. I mean, he was bringing in things like Nietzsche and existentialism and this idea of tragedy and tragic heroes that really has its influences all the way to like the Greek myths. And of course, you know, Elric stories ask, what does it mean to be the last of a decadent civilization? And can you escape your nature? And what is the cost of power? I mean, I realize that last question is kind of big and broad and kind of applies to a lot of things, but at the time, and that tragic structure in particular cannot be underestimated or under-discussed. Unlike endless fantasy series where the heroes accumulate just tons of victories and continue to level up, Elric's saga has a definite arc, and it has a devastating and even apocalyptic conclusion. Everything Elric loves, he destroys, and it is tragic in the classical sense. So if you are coming to fantasy through writers like George R.R. Martin or Joe Abercrombie or Glenn Cook or Stephen Erickson, you name it, anyone of that particular stripe, you're basically reading Elric's grandchildren. Going back to that source shows you where contemporary fantasy's moral complexity and bleakness originated, and I cannot recommend it enough. That's my sell job for Elric. Now let's talk about how you read the darn thing. The tricky thing about Elric is that unlike many of Michael Moorcock's heroes, who, when you want to say read The Adventures of Coram or Jerry Cornelius, you know where to start. There's a first book, and then there's a last book, and you just read them in order. It's very simple. It doesn't require a lot of homework. Elric can be a bit more of a challenge because Elric was written in piecemeal fashion. He was written for the magazines, and when his work has, or his adventures have been collected, they've been collected as kind of fix-up novels, novellas that have been sort of grafted together to create a readable novel-like experience. Now, the other catch to Elric is that Moorcock started his adventures at the middle point when he's coming back to his ancient kingdom to reclaim his birthright, and then the follow-up to that is the end of the story, and it's the end of Elric's entire saga. And so he basically wrote the ending before he wrote anything else. I think at the time, and I won't speak for Moorcock, but I think at the time he didn't have a lot of expectations to continue writing Elric stories. He probably wanted to write other things, particularly as a vanguard of new wave science fiction. He was probably more passionate about Jerry Cornelius and editing New Worlds magazine and kind of pushing along the careers of people like Brian Aldiss and J.G. Ballard and other luminaries of the UK science fiction scene. But he did return to Elric, and the very next thing he wrote was the eponymous book Elric of Melnibone, which was the prequel to everything that he had written up to that point. And then he started writing more Elric stories, and they kind of slot into different places. And I kind of associate it with like a artist working on a statue, you know, like he starts with a chest. It's a good chest, then he works on the head, it's a good head, let me change the nose a little bit, that kind of thing. And he's just always constantly tinkering with this character and tinkering with the existing stories to make them line up better with some of the other things he's written in the multiverse, as well as in Elric's broader saga. In the 1970s, DAW Publications put out what I think is the first truly systematic collection of Elric stories. Everything that he had written up to about 1974, I think, is when people really sort of came to Elric in terms of fandom. And that's where a lot of people, when you talk to them about the first time they experienced Elric, it is through those DAW paperbacks. Over the decades, there have been more Elric stories written, and every single Elric release incorporates the new stuff. I don't have the things from like the 1970s or 80s because it just predates me. I don't need to have that many Elric books, yet I still somehow seem to collect a lot of them. But I do have a number of them, so I thought I would just show you guys really quickly some of what I have. For example, I've only got the first volume of this, but this hardcover from White Wolf Publications, a Georgia-based publisher, by the way. Hey, hometown guys. This is a collection of some of the earliest stories in Elric's chronology. It's sort of like the first half, and then there's a second half called The Stealer of Souls. That is a follow-up to this. This was a big part of a project where Moorcock was attempting to take everything he's ever written in the Eternal Champion cycle and put it in a readable reader order, you know, that people could kind of follow along with, though I think he's changed his mind on that as like the best way to approach his work. But at the time, it was a really cool project. And this is a nice hardcover. And I hope to find the second half of it someday just for my own collection. And then we have Del Rey put out these in the mid-2000s, which this is the Chronicles of the Last Emperor of Melnibone. It is a 6-volume set. I've got all of them in various conditions because I picked them up sort of in kind of out of print. So some are like former library copies, some are used. They're all used. They're all in kind of rough shape sometimes. But this is where I actually first discovered Elric, because I started reading this before the latest editions had come out. And this is how I fell in love with him. And this has a special place in my heart. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this particular book as a part of the 3 reading orders that I'm going to discuss shortly. But also, not too long after, the UK publisher Gollancz has put out an entire series of Moorcock's work in this really fun sort of color coding. This is the first one, Elric of Melnibone, that has like a lot of ephemera and all of Elric's stories kind of placed in a chronological sequence. And I like this set a lot. I'm not crazy about the actual feel of these books, but I'm also less into UK paperbacks. I think they just have, for whatever reason, it feels like the paper quality is less good than US paperbacks. I'm not really sure why that is. I'm sure someone could tell me why, or maybe I'm just like weird and picky. But this is a really cool project that I'm glad they did complete. I think there's like 30 books, and I have almost all of them, and they make a fun little rainbow, which in previous videos you've probably seen behind my back there. And then most recently, we have the Saga hardcovers, which are the most easily accessible for US readers. You've probably seen these in bookstores. I hope you have. If you haven't, shame on your store. This is the Elric Saga Volume 1, Elric of Melnibone, which collects the first half of the core Elric Saga, along with its follow-up, Stormbringer, which is Volume 2 here. Sorry. And you can see this is like the best, most accessible way to get into Elric now. Saga has really done a great service for fantasy readers in terms of being able to make this get this back into publication. You know, for the longest time, Elric was out of print, and it was really hard to find this stuff here in the US. But between the Gollancz reprint and Saga now printing out these hardcovers over the last few years, people now are able to access them, and a very important part of fantasy history is once again in readers' hands. Okay, let's talk about the 3 reading orders. Number 1, read what you can get your hands on. In this case, it would be this Saga hardcover, which is the most easy thing to find. You can find it on Amazon, you can get it at Barnes & Noble, you can get it at your local store, I'm sure. And on Kindle, if you're an e-reader, or Kobo, it occasionally goes on sale. I got an e-reader version of this, an ebook version of this, for $1.99 the one time I saw it was on sale. And I will tell you, this is the easy way to read Elric. It takes all of the Elric stories written from 1961 all the way to about 1992, I think, 91, before the most recent Elric novel that was written that's not included in this sequence. And of course, the last Volume 3 one, which I'll talk about the more recent 2000 Elric novels. But anyway, whatever. The core Elric stories, they are in this book. And if you are someone who just wants to read, you don't really want to think about like writing styles changing, you're just like, okay, let me just read these as I read them. I want to do as little work as possible, and I just want to enjoy a beginning to end saga. This is the way to do it. I think that this is like still an easy, fine way for someone to experience Elric. You won't have any issues. The caveat I would share is that there are two novels in both of these collections that were written later on. So Moorcock, in his earlier days, was a much pulpier writer. Like, he wrote these very fast-moving stories. They're good. They're really exciting to read, but they move at a really quick pace. They're low on detail sometimes. They're low on, character interaction sometimes, and even character development, because it's all about action and entertaining, adolescent teenage boys sometimes. And they were written by a guy who was in his 20s, right? Also, sometimes they were banged out in a weekend. When you're getting paid by the story, you bang them out really fast and you have a pretty good living. At least that's the way it used to work in fiction. But as he grew older and matured as a writer, Moorcock became a much stronger literary voice. And you'll see that really as soon as the turn of the 60s come, when he starts writing stories like Behold the Man, which I've reviewed on this channel, and the World Fantasy Award winning Gloriana, what many people consider to be his masterpiece, Mother London, and one of my favorites, The Warhound and the World's Pain, another book I've talked about on this channel, I believe. Now, this mid-career maturity really became apparent in his Elric writing in a pair of later novels that he wrote. In the late 80s, we have The Fortress of the Pearl, and in the early 90s, The Revenge of the Rose. The only reason I say that as a potential caveat is that there is a bit of reader whiplash, especially if you're unfamiliar with Moorcock's writing in his career, which, if you're new to this, of course you would be unfamiliar. You go from the pulpy writing of Elric of Melnibone, which is really fast-paced and really fun, to something much more thoughtful and slower and a little more, I want to say languid, but certainly dreamlike, in The Fortress of the Pearl, which was written 16 years later. And that does create some dissonance for readers. And I have met people who have gotten kind of hung up on The Fortress of the Pearl and then just kind of never go forward, which is unfortunate, because there's just so much good stuff there. But I also understand it's very difficult to go from one style of writing to another style of writing. And then if you make it through The Fortress of the Pearl, you jump into The Sailor of the Seas of Fate and you're back into the pulpy style. It's like, whoa, what's happening? And so that could be the one potential issue with reading just what is made available to you, particularly in this first novel, in this first collection. But I would say if you want to do as little work as possible, and I can't blame you, it's just reading. It's supposed to be fun, right? This is a fine place to be. It's a great starting point. Enjoy it. The second reading order, I would only recommend to people who are as crazy as me. This is my preferred reading order, and that is reading by publication order. What I really prefer, less so this idea of like reading Elric as a character and reading through his adventures from start to finish. I'm very interested in the development of Moorcock as a writer and the development of his concepts and his growing maturity as a scribe and as a literary mind, really. And to me, one of the things I enjoy is reading the stories as they came out and discovering Elric and discovering the multiverse and discovering the Lords of Chaos and Order and all the like as Moorcock met them too. To me, that's a fun thing to do, but it's also very hard. And the question is, how do you do that? Well, there's two ways, just at least to start off with. The easiest would be to let's bring back this Del Rey collection, which you can get, I think, affordably. Of all the Elric collections in this series, this is the easiest one to find, and it includes all of the initial Elric short stories from this collection called The Stealer of Souls, and then its follow-up Stormbringer. It gives you all the first batch of Elric that you'll ever need, and you can decide if you like Elric from there, and you can probably get this really affordably. It also has some really cool contemporaneous material, some articles about the origin of Elric that were written, and the origins of the term sword and sorcery, and just a lot of stuff that kind of puts you in that time frame. It gets a little readier and harder to follow this publication order after this, because, you know, this is when Moorcock starts jumping around in time a little bit. There's like the Vanishing Tower, or the Sleeping Sorceress, and then there's the Elric of Melnibone novel, and then you kind of go from there. But if you want to do this, and you are a person who is a little out of their mind like me, you could pick this up, or you could go to ISFDB, which is the International Speculative Fiction Database, and just look up Michael Moorcock's Elric saga in publication order. It's pretty easy to do. You just go to his bibliography and you can figure it out. But if you need help, I'm happy to make a list there. Maybe I'll even put a list in the comments so you guys can do that too if you want. But you can kind of follow along that way. Or if you have both of these saga hardcovers, you can follow along and do it that way. You can just find the list and read the stories that way. I don't know, if anybody will really want to do that, but just in case, I thought I would mention it. It is my preferred reading order, but it probably won't be yours. And lastly, what I kind of consider to be a sort of compromise order, and this is the order that I know many people gravitate towards, and it probably is the one that you'll want to do if you want to sort of avoid that whiplash of The Fortress of the Pearl and Revenge of the Rose. And I think there is some really good in-story rationale for why you might want to do this order anyway. And that is the Daw reading order, and following sort of the core Elric saga along with the later novels later. So that means, again, you can work with both of these hardcovers and do this. And what's really nice is, unlike my publication order preference, this is helpfully labeled in a way that follows along with the old Daw collections. So all you have to do is just pick up one of these books and simply skip The Fortress of the Pearl and The Revenge of the Rose and just read everything else that isn't those two stories. And then you go back and you read them. And for a lot of people, this is how they discovered Elric. It's like revisiting folks who found him in the 70s and then read the new Elric novels as they came out. It's just kind of a different approach to publication order, but also has a greater coherency, because not only do you get a beginning, middle, and end, you're also reading these later Elric novels in the greater context in which they were written. And that is in this sort of mega story that he was writing that built up to what is in the Elric Saga Volume 3, The White Wolf. It's best to read those after those core Elric stories, because it's really possible that with all of the Sturm and Drang that happens in the pulpier earlier stuff, you may have forgotten some details anyway. And really, if you get that far and you get to the point that you've read those first two Elric volumes, you've read those later Elric novels, and you want to read more, that's where things like this Volume 3 of the Elric Saga, The White Wolf, which is his new sort of Millennium trilogy of stories, which some people have a little more difficulty with because it's like Elric on a Dream Quest, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's really fascinating. And then you can also read this, as a prequel to that, the Von Beck series that I read this past year and absolutely adored, especially the first book, which I mentioned, The Warhound of the World's Pain. And once you get that far and you complete all those, then you can read The Citadel of Forgotten Myths, the most recent Elric novel from Moorcock, and may end up being the final one, though there's already another short story that I haven't read. See, it never stops. He never stops chipping away. Anyway, those are my 3 options for you as a new Elric reader. I think really option number 3, which is recommended by Stephen Andrews, the bookseller. It's recommended by a lot of people in the Michael Moorcock Facebook group. I think that still is like the way to go, both for reader experience, but also for in-story coherency, and even to prepare yourself for later Elric books. It just makes a lot of sense. It's just the way they were written. But hey, if you're cool like me, publication order is always going to be there. Anyway, thank you for indulging me. Like, comment, subscribe as always. We'll see you next week. Keep on reading. Bye. This video is sponsored by me. I have a book out. Do you like short horror stories in the vein of Stephen King? Small town interconnected intrigue a la Ray Bradbury? The narrative weirdness of Gene Wolfe? Then this may be the book for you. Pick up Taking Root by Kyle Pinion today at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and any online book retailer.